So you want to be a photographer, huh? I don't know why the fuck anybody wants to do that. One of you asked in the comments here on the channel, just to kind of, because I know a lot of you are coming from my other channel who probably have never really fucked with photography, but are generally interested in maybe learning how, at least, at the very least, how I do it, if not how other people might be doing it and stuff. But one of the things you want to ask yourself is why you want to be a photographer to begin with, first of all. Do you just want to take better pictures so that your Facebook looks better than everybody else's Facebook, or your Instagram looks better than everybody else's Instagram? If that's your goal, you don't need to spend thousands of dollars on gear to do that. All you need to do is really just learn some concepts of photography, because a lot of modern phones will get the job done. So when you ask me what you should buy for your first camera, which is a very common question, I'm going to say use what you already got first. Learn the basics. Learn the limitations as well. Now, the first camera most of you are going to start out with, and we're back to the fucking phone again, is your phone. Now, this has a lot of limitations, but you can, as we'll see a little bit later when I go through my progress through photography and why I did it, you can get good pictures out of that. But in order to do that, you just got to understand some of the basic concepts, like the exposure triangle, for example. There are 3 settings when you go full manual that you have to balance to get the correct exposure, and the correct amount of noise, the correct amount of background blur. Your control of the image starts with taking your ass out of auto, because when you let this make decisions for you, it's going to make shitty decisions. So when you first get into your phone, most likely you're going to be in some kind of auto mode, and in auto mode, this thing, isn't going to do a great job. It's going to make its best guess. Sometimes you can, in good lighting, use auto mode and get a good picture, but it's not really your picture completely, because you're letting the computer inside your phone make important decisions about exposure. And you need to, as a photographer, to be creative, to add your look to things. Maybe you like a contrasty picture where all of your shadows are really well defined and you have to guess what's in them. Or maybe you like the low contrast, more vintage look where you can see everything in the shadows, kind of more of an HDR-ish look with maybe a soft, high-key touch to it. There's all of these decisions are difficult to make if you don't have control of your camera, even if that camera is your phone. Never use the selfie side of this. Even when you're taking a selfie, the lenses and the sensor are always they're better technology on the front side of the camera. Plus, if you have a dual lens like this particular phone, which gives you a tighter shot, which gives you a more flattering appearance to your picture, it just can't be matched. Now, granted, they've done a lot of software things to this side to make it so you can take perfect selfies. But if you're a photographer, you're not really concerned with taking pictures of yourself. You want to take pictures of the things that you want to experience and share and tell a story about, whether you're out in the world doing landscapes or whether you're taking pictures of your friends. You want to take the best pictures possible. You want your friends to be like, fuck yeah, that was the best picture anybody ever took of me. I've had people tell me that I've taken the best picture of them that they've ever had taken. which is a very, flattering thing to hear as a photographer, and it's probably why I still get hired for shit even though I don't market anymore. So overall, you just got to think about your settings. So one of the first things you need to do, and hopefully if your phone can't do this, then you need to buy a camera that does. Get the hell out of auto mode to start with. The only way to learn how to control your exposure, to control your background, to control your noise is to get out of auto mode. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to your phone. If you have a Samsung or a phone that's based on Samsung software, you're going to get into Pro mode. Now, if you look at Pro mode here, it's overexposed because I played with it earlier. So first thing I'm going to do is bring my shutter speed up because this is a well-lit room. Now, if I turn the lighting down on this, you're going to see that, this is probably perfect exposure. My ISO is all the way down right now. So the three settings you got to be concerned with when it comes to photography. You got your aperture. That's how big the eyeball is, the hole. You can see it in a lens. As you adjust your aperture, you'll see it close up the higher the number, or open up the lower the number. The limitation of the phone, this phone has dual aperture, which is nice, but it switches between 1.5, which is probably as wide open as you can get on this sensor. We'll get into crop factor and all that another time. But just know it's how much the eye is open in your glass, and that affects your depth of field. Like right now, this aperture is wide open on this lens, so I don't have a lot of depth of field. That's why I have to stand right here. But if I walk a little closer, you see, because this is manually focused, that it's not very far before I start to soften up and step out of into a blurry fucking image. And if I go too far back, the same thing will happen. I'll get blurrier. My depth of field is a little bit better on this camera because it's a micro four thirds. This is a GH5 I'm shooting this video with. But overall, that is how the sensor size affects your depth of field. How fast the lens is affects your depth of field. However, on a phone like this, your sensor is so small that depth of field is a little bit larger. It's harder to get a blurry background. Also, how close you are to the lens affects how blurry your background is. So if you want to get a really blurry background with a phone, you got to put the phone almost like macro, like right up on whatever you're shooting. And that'll enhance your blurry background. That's the only control you have with a phone over your depth of field. And it tries to fake it by giving you the blurry background option, which in my opinion looks fake and like shit. And it doesn't look as good as a real lens on a larger sensor. Anything over micro four thirds, in my opinion. We can get into the micro four thirds versus crop versus full frame when you start to know a lot more. This video is kind of for beginners. So play around with your phone. Experiment. Watch videos on the exposure triangle. Another thing that this fucks up, particularly in auto mode, is it's going to lower your shutter speed. I can shoot, the lens in this is stabilized, I can shoot at a 1/6 of a second handheld successfully and get a decently sharp image out of it. Problem with that is if your subject's moving, they're going to blur. The shutter speed is how long you blink. How long is the shutter open? How long is it letting light hit the sensor? And the longer it lets light hit, the longer it allows the light to hit the sensor. Like say you open it up the sensor for 1 second. That's 1 second where light is coming into the sensor and it's storing the information. That dictates how bright your exposure is, but any movement that happens during that time frame is going to be blurry. So what you see a lot of with phone pictures set to auto, because it'll automatically in auto mode drop your shutter speed down to as low as a 1/15 of a second, and that'll make everything fucking blurry. The only way around that is to jack up the third thing of the exposure triangle. That's the sensitivity of your sensor. And as you crank up that sensitivity, you get all kinds of noise. This is the Galaxy S9. I can get a decent picture, JPEG, out of this at about 200 ISO. If I shoot RAW, the noise is ridiculous. The noise is actually ridiculous at ISO 50 when you shoot RAW. You can see color noise, and what they've done with phones nowadays is they've put a software algorithm in that takes away some of the sharpness of your image in exchange for getting rid of noise. And it's getting pretty good at cleaning up those JPEGs that come out of here. If you shoot RAW on your phone, which not every phone could do, this phone does allow you to shoot RAW, which anytime you can shoot RAW, you should if you plan on editing your photos. But if you want them to look good right out of the camera and you're not planning on learning how to edit, which you should plan to learn how to edit, because that's half of photography in my book, you want to shoot RAW. So you can shoot DNGs on here. It's a little option you can enable in there. So if you look at the picture size, it's 9 megapixels, right? But when you shoot that JPEG, you're not getting that perceptually 9 megapixels. It's going to look a little soft on a bigger screen, or if you zoom or crop your picture in post. So that's one of the limitations of this camera. It's not the fucking best camera in the world. However, you can take good pictures with a phone. So if you're just starting out, play with your phone, learn all the manual settings. You can adjust your shutter speed all the way up to 10 seconds on some of these phones. Not all the phones will allow you to do this. But if you have a modern smartphone, which I see a lot of people seem to nowadays, and you have this, start learning on this before you go out and purchase a bigger camera. If you fall in love with making images with this, also you can get Snapseed as a good photo editor that you can use on here. It does have support for raw images now, allowing you to push your images a little bit further. The reason you want to shoot RAW is because it stores more information than a JPEG. So like if you fuck up your exposure, you can boost it in post, and which you don't want to do even with the RAWs from this, because that's how shitty the RAWs are out of this sensor, because it's so small. They overcome that limitation with software, and honestly the best looking photos, as far as the least amount of work in post you got to do, are gonna be JPEG. So get it right in the camera. And they now have settings in there so you can adjust your contrast, your white balance, all of that before you even take the picture. Ultimately, that might be the better way to go with the phone, because it's just the raw image that you get out of it is noisy. It sucks, you know. It's shitty. So that's kind of the limitations of the phone. You can do awesome shit with this phone. I have made and sold stock photography from this phone. Well, not this phone, but a couple generations ago of this. I think the S3, S4, S5. I created images. The way I did that is I took advantage of some techniques which allowed me to make a panorama, a manual panorama, not the panorama mode in the camera, where I would just take pictures of sections, stitch them together in post, and I'd have like 100 megapixel image, which 100 megapixels, you can push zoom really far, you can blow up really big, you can put on big screens, and it looks sharp, it looks awesome. And I'm going to go through some of my early pictures here shortly. So, you know, with me, just to give you an idea how I got started and why I became a photographer, I started out learning 3D graphics. I have this passion for learning skills that I can use to express myself and perhaps maybe make a living doing. At the time, I was on this kick about 3D CG graphics. I wanted to make my own little animations. I wanted to do stock animations, stock, you know, illustrations using like Autodesk Maya, Poser, and a few other, 3D programs to, be creative and perhaps sell my work. In order to do that, I wanted to not have to pay for a shit ton of textures, which is something in 3D graphics you use that's usually photographic in nature or something from a graphic designer that you put on your 3D models to make them look realistic. I was getting into all of that, so I went out and I said, well, I need a high megapixel camera, at least 24 megapixels, which I did. And I went out and bought the D5500, the Nikon D5500. Now, you can probably find this camera relatively, the D5500 a little bit cheaper than this used. However, the D5600 is the current iteration of that camera. They brought in SnapBridge, but essentially it's the same sensor that, I used. And that camera was my workhorse. I started getting paying gigs with that camera. It's not the bestest camera in the world, but it will teach you photography because you have to master that camera to get good images out of it. You're not just going to throw it in fucking auto, pull it out of your bag, and take brilliant pictures. You need to put some decent glass on it just to bring it up to above phone speeds. It comes with a kit lens, which you can squeeze a landscape out of at higher f-stops. But for the most part, for portrait work or anything where you're trying to get the blurry background thing going, you want the kit lens to be gone. You need something sharper and better to take advantage of it. And you start putting prime lenses on it and so on and so forth. But I bought this camera with its kit lens and started to take pictures with it. And people's, I would post them and people started saying, hey, that looks pretty, they were like amazed that I had some kind of eye for this. So I was like, wow, I didn't know I had this talent. So I went out and honed it. And it involved practice. It involved countless video workshops, lectures, tutorials on YouTube, anything I could find that would increase my technical knowledge of photography and might enhance some of my creative work. I learned all about the software. I learned all about the camera. I learned about the exposure triangle. I learned about depth of field. I learned how to take advantage of things. I learned some advanced techniques to make a cheaper camera like this as good, output an image, which you can, by the way, as good as or better than a $4,000 camera, which at the time I could not afford. And you should never buy one of those cameras straight out of the gate. Work your way up to those cameras. Do a couple $1,000 weddings before you spend $3 or $4 grand on a camera. And, over time I bought new glass, I extended, I bought a second body at one point. But I started out essentially with a camera just like the D5600. It was the D5500. And I would argue if you were going to do it today, I would go with the D5600. But some of you might want to go Canon, some of you might want to go Sony mirrorless, some of you might want to even do Micro Four Thirds as your first camera. Micro Four Thirds, I think you won't get quite as good an image unless you're buying some really expensive glass and some really expensive Metabones adapters to go with it. But at that point in spending, with the GH5 being $2,000 just for the body, you might as well buy a full frame camera and glass at that point. So I would not suggest the GH5 or a Panasonic camera, Micro Four Thirds, is a great starter photography camera. However, the GH5 is a brilliant video camera, but we'll get into that in another video. So I started out with that camera. So what kind of pictures did I take? Well, this fucking cat picture you've been staring at is one of the first pictures I took. One of the first things I did purchase for my camera is flash. Being able to control your light is one of the keys to being a photographer. It's great to be a natural light motherfucker, but then you're at the mercy of whatever environment you are in. And there's some really shitty lighting environments. If you're outside, you're at the mercy of every cloud that passes overhead, or sometimes just the bright sun in the middle of the sky and your client wants to do a shoot at fucking 1 in the afternoon. And you're stuck with that time. And so you have to make the best of lighting, and sometimes you're going to need flash to fight the sun, to light your subject. And, you know, there's just no way around it. You need to buy lighting at some point. But I would start out with just a good speed light that you can bounce off of the wall, off of the ceiling, and you'll get way more flattering lighting than you would ever get with this cell phone whose fucking sound I didn't turn down before I made this fucking video. So, I started out with that, and I took pictures like this cat picture. Now, let's go through some of the pictures from my early days, 4 years ago. This is one of the first pictures I took at Chittenango Falls, and, you know, I used it, actually, the top part of the picture, as my, you know, business card for a while. I came up with a shitty name for my photography company at the time. Just name it after yourself. Don't try and be creative about it. You know, eventually the photographer, your name brand, is your name recognition at that point, and that's what you should roll with. And eventually I rebranded to just use my name as my photography company. But first time I was so happy with this picture. You know, you can see how all of the, you know, the water is fucking blurry and shit, right? You know, and that nice silky smooth movement. In order to do this with a phone, you would need a tripod and a phone capable of allowing you a slow shutter speed, and you would have to wait till it was almost dark unless you have an ND filter for your phone. In this case, I waited till it was a really overcast day, and this was in a forested part, so I was able to get the shutter speed down to the slow enough speed to make the nice, milky, blurry waterfalls. In my early days, I wasn't too great with the white balance. That came later in life. But at the same time, this photo was edited. The vignette that you see kind of around it was all done in post through Lightroom. I've worked with Lightroom and Photoshop, and learned both of those softwares inside and out, which is a necessary thing if you're going to do it professionally. But if you're just fucking around, and it's just fun to just fuck around with the software and the editing process and seeing what you can come up with. We can go over that in future tutorials if you guys are interested in that. So, yeah, it was as simple, and this was shot with the D5500. So this is pretty quality. I do believe I even used the kit lens on this particular shot. So, and it's just because it's wide enough angle to get it all in one go. I had a 50mm prime f1.8 at the time, and I also had a shitty zoom, but you know, it was I think it was 55 to 300 millimeters, made specifically for a crop sensor. Not a very fast lens either. I think it was it went from 3.2 up to, I don't know, it's been a while. I got rid of that lens a long time ago. But it was my first telephoto lens that allowed me to take portraits. But it is entirely possible to take portraits with a lens like that, and I used it plenty. And got stock approved, and they're sticklers for image quality. And it was sharp enough to get the job done, but it wasn't still, it's, you know, you're not going to get super sharp unless you have really expensive glass is the thing. And you're kind of, if you're buying really expensive glass, you know, and by all means do it, but because you can use that on the next body up or whatever. But if you're going to commit to an ecosystem like I did with Nikon, just know that that's the system you're buying glass for. Now we're in the mirrorless revolution, so maybe you want to hedge against the future and pick up a mirrorless camera. However, my experience with the Sony A6300 is it's slow, even slower than this Nikon was. Unresponsive in terms of photography. I was missing shots due to the slowness of it, processing the images. Overall, the image quality was comparable, but the glass, there wasn't a lot of good, inexpensive glass. or primes that was available for the 6300, whereas the Nikon had the whole Nikon fucking history of lenses at its disposal, and you're able to even put some of the best full frame primes on it for a fairly cheap price and get amazing image quality and sharpness out of these lenses that you have to pay almost $1,000 to get on a Sony mirrorless. So that's something to keep in mind too. If you're looking to keep it cheap, I would still go with the Nikon D5600 or the 3500 as your beginner camera, and just invest in glass. And then once you make a little bit money with that shittier camera, you know, save that money and then use that, sell the old camera, buy the next model until you're up to full frame. This was also done with that camera. This got rejected for, I guess they didn't like my artistic vision or some shit. This was just shot with the kit lens, up angled at a tree at Beaver Lake, I believe it was. Pretty much it was late fall, almost early winter. All the leaves were gone. And, you know, it was just be creative. Don't just stand and take a picture at one fucking angle. Get underneath shit, get over shit, get around shit. Look up, look down, look to the side, look behind you. You know, there's all kinds of pictures out there that you're going to find. And if you're looking around and not just focus where everybody is, then you don't end up with the same pictures that everybody else takes. And that allows you to stand out a bit. And the more you stand out in the crowd, the more likely it is people are going to hire you to take pictures for them. But don't be disheartened if you can't afford the fucking camera yet. You know, I loved this picture when I took it, and I did it with a phone. It's not perfect, you know, it's subjective, but I enjoyed this picture. And, you know, it got lots of likes when I posted it at the time. It was, you know, it stood out, even though this was done with a phone. I edited it. I did some dodging and burning. You can see how it's really kind of brighter near the water as opposed to some of the other areas of the picture. So I draw the eye in. There's a leading line going in. The rule of thirds isn't well enforced there. You know, the only flaw I critique right now from it, from back in the day, aside from being soft because it's the phone picture, is up in the corner there's fucking little bit of a branch that I should have just fucking airbrushed out. But other than that, you know, this was done at a rest area in Canada while I was still driving a truck. So, and that's the other thing. I didn't just like jump into photography, although later on I did, trying to keep it as a full-time business. We'll tell that story another time. But for the most part, I was learning as I continued to do my other career, and that's usually the track that most photographers find before they try and make the leap to full-time. Now you've seen this picture floating around. It's one of my early self-portraits, and it was taken with the D5500. I do believe I had just bought the 85 millimeter. No, that was a 50 mil, I think. Yeah, that might have been the 50. All I did was, this was probably my first off-camera flash, and I bought some remote triggers so that I could take the flash, the speed light that I told you is one of the first things you're going to want to buy, off the camera. I ended up with 2 speed lights at one point, but this was just with 1 speed light and like a $50 umbrella kit. And I set my settings to a point where the only light that would show up in the camera is the light from the flash. This was actually in a room that had a little bit of light going on in it. It wasn't black in the room. And I didn't really need to do much because all I did was set my shutter speed to a point where you didn't get any of the ambient light. The only light you got was from the flash, you know, and also kept my ISO low enough that you didn't pick up any of the ambient light. So, you know, when you can produce images like this, granted this was a selfie and it's of an ugly motherfucker with a beard, you know, but when you can start doing images like that, you're going to have people that want you to take headshots for them, want you to do portraits for them. And all you got to do is do that, show people what you can do, or maybe have a few friends who are more than willing to let you do free shit for them, go and shoot your photography for them, and then they show all their friends, and that's how you get started with people. And then when people start asking you to shoot for them, then you can start asking for compensation, because it is hard work doing all of this. The editing process is lengthy. You spent the money to buy all of this gear to be able to do this kind of thing, and that's kind of, you know, this is all possible with a cheaper body. You don't need the biggest, baddest ass camera. Biggest, baddest ass cameras do make things a lot easier. Don't get me wrong. It is nice when you can grab focus really quick. But in the early days, you're not going to master photography as far as the technical side unless you're forced to deal with certain issues. One of them being focus and autofocus and all of those things. There's another landscape done with the kit lens on the D5500. This is Alexandria Bay. This I sold as stock, and it did sell a couple times. I didn't make a lot of money on in stock photography because I didn't spend the time building up a huge library of stock with which to get a nice little residual income from. But over time, some of my pictures I've got on there have made 50, 60 bucks just for one picture. You know, and it could be more if I would have taken the time. But keywording's very tedious and time consuming, not to mention the approval process, and then just generally trying to market stock photography is a whole full-time job in and of itself. But, you know, if you like doing landscapes, I just want to show you that you can do beautiful landscapes. You can even do the high megapixel ones if you learn some techniques of combining images together in panoramas and what kind of lenses to use and how to move that, you know, the tripod, which you generally would want to shoot with. You can do it handheld too, but you get better results when you're more, you know, organized with your movement. Urbex, one of my favorite forms of photography. And you're going to be seeing some of that coming on this channel because I like urbex, and that's where you explore abandoned places. The place I shot this in was Cinema North. I've done a couple of runs of photography, and I did an adventure video on my main channel exploring Cinema North, which no longer exists. Now, you know, there's this place that was there that had this history to it that did become abandoned and then had its own story to tell, and there was tons of little things you can find between the graffiti, the things that people broke, things that they, you know, are destroyed in there, the things that, you know, it has its own story, and you try and piece it together. That's why I like urbex, is you're trying to figure out what happened there based on what's left of the place, you know. And, you know, that's great. And I thought this picture was humorous because some asshole, you know, was like, oh, well, we got a toilet, so we need to put the no dumping sign in there. It's pretty funny and shit. One of the biggest money makers in stock photography was what I originally got a camera to do in the first place, and that is my own textures and backgrounds. There's a huge market for this. You would think taking pictures of walls and boards and ground and fucking paint drying or some other shit would kind of be fucking boring and suck. But in the end, these are some of the best-selling pictures in the stock world because other creatives use these pictures. You know, graphic designers use them for backgrounds, for websites, for illustrations, to build their own creative works off of. 3D graphics and video game creators, they use these as textures on their 3D models. You know, website designers use this stuff. News organizations use this stuff. You know, there's all kinds of applications just for taking pictures of unique materials. And it surprised me at first when I got into photography that one of the ways I was able to pay the bills was just taking pictures of walls and shit. Which one of the best fucking pictures, most selling stock one of the best selling stock photos I ever took was this fucking TV. It was the girl I was dating at the time. Her dad had a like antique like swap shop type thing with a bunch of old shit in it. And we were in there kind of taking pictures of antiques and old stuff, and I came across this old black and white TV. And, you know, it had some branding on it, so I had to go in. I had to clean up the screen. I did all of that in post. I also took out some of the logos and all of that so that it would sell for stock. Because I knew right away vintage TVs were in, you know, in terms of anything vintage was at the time very popular. And it's still to this day, I get sales on this image, which definitely, you know, considering it was a TV sitting in an abandoned building that anybody could have probably took a picture of, but because no one else took the time to do that, people needed a vintage TV. There's all kinds of shit you could do with an image like this. You could cut out the screen and put shit in there and have videos with it in there, or movies, or whatever, or backgrounds, or build, you know, I used this as a business card for a while. So there's a whole bunch of things to think about when you're getting into this as far as ways you can monetize and make a little money, or at the very least earn some of the money back that you spend on the gear, you know, which is ultimately the goal. A lot of the gear I buy, I use in one creative way or another, whether it's taking pictures, whether it's making video, whether it's doing YouTube. I try and do things that can bring some of the money I spent on the gear back to me. And there are camera bodies that I paid entirely for with money I earned taking pictures. And that's how I've been able to maintain being able to have gear and keep up with the current technology as much as possible. And a lot of it's just getting paying gigs, selling off old gear, buying new gear as I go. And, you know, take it as far as you want to take it. If you want to be a full-time photographer, obviously you want to be careful with how much you spend on gear because you're also living off of that money. But as this has always been a side gig for me, I can afford to reinvest the money that I take in from photography in better gear. And that's pretty much what I've been doing. But of course, I get a lot of entertainment and enjoyment out of photography. This picture has also made it into stock photography and has sold a few times. This is a rusty ass wheel on my old rusty ass pickup truck I used to drive. I did this entirely with a phone. I edited it entirely on the phone, and I uploaded it to stock, see if they'd take it, and they did. And all it is a rusty ass, really gritty wheel that could potentially be a background for something or integrated in some way with some graphic design. And that's really all you got to think about and think creative about in terms of trying to make a little bit of dough with your camera. But ultimately, if you're just in it for fun and you just want to get started, but you don't want to spend $5,000 getting enough gear to take like some Ansel Adams fucking best hits pictures, then this is the way to go. And I do believe buying these entry-level cameras, like the Nikon D5500, each brand has its own entry-level bar of $500. It's harder to enter $300 to $500 range with the mirrorless world, though. There's not a lot of entry-level good cameras. I mean, you got the Sony a6000, which I don't know that, even though the next step up is the a63 or 6400, and then we just got the a6500 with the flippy up screen. Those are all great options, but that's a $1,000 camera without the lens, or you even get there is a shitty kit lens you get for like 50 extra bucks that they tack on. But body only, you're looking at $1,000, whereas the D5600, yeah, it's still the old DSLR model, and it's a crop sensor, but you get that and lenses, and you can even go on Amazon. You could check it out in the affiliate links, which will help this channel grow if you guys purchase gear through the Amazon links. It's the first thing I'm going to do to try and make a little income off of this fucking channel anyway. But yeah, you go through, you buy one of these entry level cameras and start learning, start doing tutorials, start doing everything you can. And that's what I did. Eventually, I worked my way up and I upgraded to the D500, which is also a crop camera, but it was like the top of the line Nikon crop sensor camera. And it performed beautifully. It was shooting, I think it was 8 or 9 frames a second, and which allowed great for action, great for, you know, being able to capture better moments, to get sharper pictures when you don't have a lot of time for setup, which isn't the case with the 5500 or 5600. You're going to need to anticipate your shots a lot more instead of grabbing, you know, focus, because the focusing system isn't as fast and it's not as good as tracking because you don't have as many focusing points. So, you know, that's what upgrading gets you, is it makes the camera more responsive. It gives you more features. You get higher megapixel counts, especially when you go to full frame. And eventually I took that D500 and sold it off and got a D850, which is my current camera that I use for photography now, and I'm in love with that camera. It's big, it's bulky, it's 42 megapixels, and it's full frame, and it shoots, you know, about 7 or 8 frames a second. I can boost it to 9 if I buy a battery grip, which I haven't done for it, because I haven't felt the need to. I feel like when you're snapping 42 megapixel images, I don't think 9 frames a second is very practical. You're going to eat through your cards very quickly in that way. But, you know, and I love that camera. It takes excellent images right away without having to really set up or you know, do a lot of preparation and anticipation. You can grab focus really quick. You can shoot brilliant looking video on it, but the autofocus is manual focus video. Nikon autofocus has always been a pile of shit, you know, new mirrorless cameras aside. But yeah, basically that's how you get started. So when you ask me what your first camera should be, that would be my recommendation. If you want to go with Canon's version, but Canon does tend to gimp their entry-level cameras intentionally to protect their higher level cameras, whereas Nikon will throw you like you get SnapBridge, Wi-Fi, and all that other shit with the 5600, which Canon would have been likely to like leave out for you. The reason why you might want to go with Nikon or Canon is they have a huge selection of both used and brand new glass and third-party lenses without having to worry about adapters and all of that shit. So, bottom line, if you're getting started, start with what you have, learn, practice, and, you know, don't just learn the technical side, learn some composition, learn some creative ways of doing things, of exposing. And we're going to go through most of this, you know, as we progress on this channel. But I just wanted to get you started. Shoot manual. Start Googling the fucking exposure triangle. You're going to get a ton of basic, boring-ass videos explaining this in detail. I don't feel the need to reinvent the wheel there. But basically, that's all there is to it. And if you got a natural eye, that helps a lot. But you can learn these things and techniques, and that's what we're planning on doing at some point on this channel, is to go out there in the world with the mission of producing some art or some landscapes or some portraits, and see what we can come up with. We're going to do adventures that involve photography, how to capture some stock, that kind of stuff. So that's some of the shit that's coming up on this channel. So if you like this video and you want to help me continue to do these videos, head to ScottTheTruckDriver.com and leave a tip in the virtual tip jar. The link is down below. You can check out my other channel, which is Scott the Truck Driver, where I talk about health, wellness, and pounding the fuckmaster and all this other stuff that I do on there. I also swear, if you haven't figured that out yet. I'm sorry, you know, but there's plenty of non-swearing motherfuckers in the photography world. This is where we swear. This is the safe space for people who talk normal and shit. So, thank you for stopping by. And I'm not a fucking expert. You know, I don't consider myself the world's best photographer or anything. But just telling you how I did it. How you do it is up to you. So have a nice motherfucking day. And shit. And end the video a little quickly because I gotta go work out now.